So we are live, just waiting for our room to populate.
I'm going to go ahead with the planning board, open our meeting or reopen it. We are open already. We were just in executive session. We've called roll, so I'm going to go through the agenda. We have two joint public hearings. The first one is to amend dimensional controls, section 6A in the general regulations and 6B lot area to further clarify applicable dimensional requirements and the effect of public purpose takings, otherwise known as eminent domain, on compliance with such requirements. The second joint public hearing is on short-term rental units. There is a revised proposed zoning ordinance for short-term rentals, which will be discussed. After that, we will go to other planning board agenda items on our own without the city council. There's a request for waivers on an application for 166, 168 Route 1 on their submission waivers. We have approval of 2 sets of minutes, and then we have other updates from the chair or the planning director. So with that, I'll turn it over to Councilor Shan to open the Planning and Development Committee meeting.
Thank you, Chair Sontag. So as Councilor Eigenman, are you present?
I'm here.
Councilor Wallace, are you present?
Here.
All right, so we have a quorum of the Planning and Development Committee. I will turn it over to Director Port.
Sure, thank you. We have 2 amendments on the agenda this evening. I'm not sure if which one you'd like to handle first. A, I think, is pretty straightforward. That is this zoning amendment originated with some discussion about the West End or Cutter Fire Station. And it became apparent that we didn't have a provision in our ordinance that dealt with what happens to lots that may become non-conforming as a result of a public purpose taking or eminent domain. So KP Law had suggested some language. Councilor Eigenman had agreed to sponsor this. And I think there's a couple of other housekeeping tweaks from the zoning rewrite that were put into that amendment as well. And we recommend adoption of this amendment, but happy to elaborate on that further or defer to Councilor Eigenman if you'd like to speak to that.
Councilor Eigenman.
Sorry, I'm not getting any audio. Is Councilor Eigenman, are you there?
Can you hear me now?
He's on the attendees side.
Whoops. Can you hear me
Yeah.
now? All right, sorry about that. All right. Oh dear.
If there are 2 devices on the room, just muting one should work.
Yeah. Okay, I'm hanging up the other one. All right, how about now?
Perfect.
Okay, all right, so very quickly, this amendment is basically an ambiguity in our zoning code. There are many other communities that have closed up these ambiguities with a specific provision where you don't want to put a property owner into non-compliance due to a taking, where, the land has been taken from them for a public purpose and they're out of the frying pan into the fire. So that's all this is. However, it was pointed out at the city council, well, there's additional language in here that it doesn't just relate to the taking issue. Why is it in here? And the answer is, when we were working on the zoning advisory committee, there were other things that we wanted to fix in this general regulation. So I figured if we're amending it, we might as well do all of it. And so the language is merely clarifying. The only substantive change is that if there's a taking, it doesn't put you into non-compliance for lot size. Thank you.
Chairs, did you want to do public comment on the amendment separately or together at the end?
No, just on this one first, right, Councilor Shand? And get this,
Yes.
put this to bed
Yes.
and then move on to
Yes,
the
Chair
next one.
Sontag. I
Okay.
agree wholeheartedly.
I'll let you take over managing the process.
All right, are there any comments to be made on the amendment? Please raise your electronic hand.
Not seeing any takers, chairs.
I am not seeing any either. All right, we can close public comment and bring it back into the committees. Chair Sontag, do you want to have a discussion amongst your crew?
Yes, comments from any planning board members? Pretty straightforward. All right, I guess we're okay. Back to you.
All right, Counselor Wallace, Counselor Eigenmann. I don't believe, well, Counselor Eigenmann probably doesn't have any comments, but Counselor Wallace, do you have any questions or comments?
I do not have any comments.
All right. For the planning board, Chair Sontag, do you want to take your vote, your recommendation?
Sure, I'll take a motion to recommend approval by the city council. May I have a motion?
I'll make that motion.
Thank you, Rick. Second?
I'll second that. It's MJ.
Yep, MJ, thank you. I'll just take roll call for approval. Alden,
Yes.
Beth,
Yes.
Bob,
Yes.
Heather? Is Heather with us?
Yes.
Thank you. Rick,
Yes.
MJ,
Yes.
Don,
Yes.
Bonnie, yes. Thank you. It's recommended for approval.
Thank you, Chair Sontag. So I'll take a motion from the committee.
Oh, so moved to recommend approval.
Second.
All right, let's take a roll call vote. Chair, Counselor Eigenmann,
Yes.
Counselor Wallace,
Yes.
Counselor Shand is a yes. We will recommend approval of the amendment to the City Council on Monday night. Thank you. All right. Shall we move on to the main event?
Yes, please.
All right. Director Port, do you want to pull up the short-term rental units?
Sure. I will actually defer to Councilor McCauley, who I believe is going to provide an overview. This is just to be clear, there are two ordinances before the council that relate to each other. One is a zoning amendment that primarily speaks to where in the city short-term rental units are allowed and provides some definition for those uses in the zoning ordinance, whether it is not addressed today as a permitted use. And then there is a licensing provision where short-term rental unit operators would be required to get a license from the licensing commission. Beyond, I don't know if Councilor Devlin from the council was able to join us this evening. He had a number of other things he was juggling, but I believe that Councilor McCauley has provided a good overview and perhaps do that again this evening.
I will do that, Director Port. But first, I just want to point out, this is not the amendment that we're discussing, right? This is a year ago's amendment, and this has been, it has been updated for 2021.
Sorry, I just want to make sure we claim, are you saying that I pulled up the wrong version here? Is that what you're?
Yes.
Let me just verify. I had posted the versions I had received from you, I think most recently, but let me just check.
Coincidentally, we were talking about this a year ago. The recommendations from the planning board were 10/21/20. And the version that came in was 8/30/20. And just about a year later, we are back again. So it is 2021.
Councilor McCauley, this is Bonnie Sontag. I'm seeing 8/20/2021 on the screen. Is that
As am
not?
I.
Is that not
8:30.
what we're discussing?
I do not believe that it is.
8/30/2021 is not the correct one, Counselor Wallace? I mean, Counselor McCauley?
8/30/2021 it is, but let's go. Let's see where it is. If you can scroll down a little bit. Okay, maybe my mistake, my error. So I just want to thank everyone for their patience in this. I apologize for the distraction up front. We've been able to take considerable amount of input going forward. And we've come back with a review under KP Law's purview, collecting the planning board's information from a year ago and subsequent inputs from a number of individuals. And we'd like to present to you tonight an updated and streamlined type of version on this. As I've mentioned earlier, the intent here, and as it was explained to us through our meetings with KP Law, is we're trying to get to more of a binary type of scenario here. Short-term rentals is a two-step process. This is step one. Binary meaning, are you in the approved zone? Yes, no. Are you in the approved category? Yes, no. And if yes, then you can go to licensing. So that's the intent of what we're trying to do here, instead of what might traditionally be a very detailed and enforceable zoning. Most of the enforcement side is written up in code on the licensing side, going in the general ordinance as well. But that's the intent coming in, and I'll try to go through and address the specifics here. We have three stated purposes. They've morphed a little to define short-term rental use and regulate the use of short-term rentals in the city, to incorporate responsibly the growth of the so-called home share industry into Newburyport's existing housing stocks by striking a fair balance between the preservation of permanent housing and the flexibility required for residents to benefit from this industry, and to ensure that the potential negative impacts of short-term rentals are mitigated to avoid adverse impacts in the neighborhood. One of the biggest changes you'll see here is an addition of definitions. We have three types of short-term rentals: home share rental, which is a short-term rental where the operator's primary residence and is rented as a short-term rental while the operator is not present, personally or physically present. A limited share is a short-term rental that the operator is the operator's primary resident and is rented as a short-term rental while the operator is physically and personally present overnight. A room in their home maybe. And an owner adjacent unit is not the operator's primary residence, but is located on the same lot as the primary residence. Think of it as a 2 or 3 family type of establishment. The primary residence is a unit. It is a residential unit designated by the operator as her principal place of residence for no fewer than 183 days of year, consistent with Mass law. The residential unit is a lawful dwelling unit that makes up all part of the 3 categories: 101, 102, and 103. A short-term rental unit made available by its operator in exchange for payment for residency occupancy by others for a period of less than 32 days. It has been suggested that we further detail that by saying things like a residential unit rented for a period of more than 32 days is not a short-term rental, to avoid any conflict and confusion. We've also heard additional work that is not included here, but that's a suggestion. A suggestion is made. We have in the licensing section, but another suggestion was made to add a short-term rental is not a lodging house. We do have that in the licensing section 9-306 subsection E, so that we clearly state what we're trying to do. The specific districts were permitted have changed. What we've heard is that they're permitted in R2, R3, B2, and B3, and not permitted anywhere else. There is a suggestion that R2 and R3 be moved from permitting to special permitting. That I leave that to your consideration and debate. The requirements and restrictions. Each short-term rental should comply with the following. B2 and B3 short-term rental permitted solely when located above the first floor. We're trying to incorporate all of the things that we've heard. There should be no physical or external physical evidence to differentiate it. The short-term rental should not create excessive noise, fumes, odor, dust. We stayed with this because referencing specific zoning or code of ordinance, we've just gone through an update to our code of ordinance, and tracking down individual code numbers as they've changed along the way has been quite extensive. So we thought we'd address it two ways, saying, create excessive noise, fumes, etc., and also saying that the short-term rental should operate under a valid license issued by the licensing committee and shall comply with all applicable laws, ordinances, codes, rules, and regulations. We think that covers it, and is as definitely vague as gives us the ability to deal with this. Only an operator may offer a short-term rental for rent, and again, an operator was defined previously as a natural person, owner of record of the residential unit, who is legally authorized to act in relation to the short-term unit as a owner of record. It can be an LLC, an officer, or a corporation, etc., but there still needs to be a physical person tied to that. Except in the Plum Island Overlay District, provided and as is otherwise provided for owner adjacent units, no operator may operate more than one short-term rental at a time. Parking short-term rental shall provide a plan to provide off-street parking to accommodate all areas of use of property, including the proposed short-term rental. Again, the suggestion is we'd be open to further definition, i.e. linking parking spots to number of bedrooms, etc. But again, we'd ask that you review and consider that in committee. And then we get to the occupancy and use limitation. So a limited share, which is where you could, there's no limitation on the days. There is a limitation of guests and bedrooms. And this is where you have to be present, physically present, for this to be operated. A home share rental unit, which I think the lawyers got ahead of us in this language a little bit, is really it's 90 days. You can rent and not be present for up to 90 days a year. And occupancy of a home share rental unit shall be limited to a maximum of 4 bedrooms and a maximum of 8 people. And owner adjacent unit, there's no limitation on the number of days. And it's usually an owner occupied 2 or 3 family where the owner owns all of the property, all of the units. And an operator of the owner adjacent residential unit may not make available at the same time both a owner adjacent unit and a home share or limited share unit serving as the primary residence. We're being consistent in only allowing one short-term rental unit at a time. Ineligible units, no short-term rental unit for affordable housing or anything listed on the town's subsidized housing inventory. No temporary home, camper, trailer, RV, lean-to, etc. No unit which has an in-law apartment special permit has been issued as a short-term rental. Exempt units, residential units for hospital or convalescent stays, residential units for institutional and business stays, and Plum Island short-term rentals located within the Plum Island Overlay District may be used for any number of days. An operator need not meet the primary resident requirement and is not limited in the number of short-term rentals they make available within that. But within the licensing side, they must be licensed and registered with the state and licensed with the city as well. And as I said, this is a little bit of a streamlined version of what we were talking about before, but we had a different intent in this to make it as straightforward as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Counselor.
Director Port, if I know you were asking Councilor Devlin if he could give an update. I have that update. If you'd like me to give it at the same time to explain where we are with the general ordinance, which is in licensing and permits.
That would be wonderful, recognizing that the planning board is really only expected to comment on the zoning. It's helpful context given the relationship. Thank you.
Sure. I believe it's been also attached in there, so I'm sure that you've looked at it. The latest version has left licensing and permits with some slight modifications, mostly some wordsmithing, sentence structure, and they have asked for a final review from KP Law on specifics in terms, specific questions in terms of enforcement and approval and denial of the application itself. So they had no structural problems with the definitions, the limitations that were consistent with you. Definitions meaning home share, limited share, home adjacent share, the number of days, etc. Along the way. They had no issues structurally with the registration process and the application, the information asked within the application process itself. What they did have was that, where we have complaints and we have enforcement, they wanted to get some specific examples that they could cite so they could have consistency in the document. So that is in front of KP Law. It's been there a couple of weeks, and we are expecting that to come out momentarily. Thank you.
Thank you. Chairs, I guess we turn it back to you as to how you'd like to handle either public comment or questions from the board or boards.
I believe we talked about having questions at this point only for clarification, but not for any kind of discussion, because we'd rather hear from the public first and take their comments into consideration when we go into a full discussion. So at this point, if planning board members have any questions, just for clarification for Councilor McCauley, this would be the time to ask. Are there any? Alden.
Yeah, I just, a little bit of a clarification where on the definitions of operator and the requirement of the primary resident, where it talks about the owner can be a LLC or corporation. I guess I'm trying to sort out if the director of the corporation is designated as the operator, where we say that needs to be the primary resident, that means that person is has that unit as their primary residence.
Yes.
Is that okay? So
you couldn't have 119 Ferry Street LLC and have the head of the corporation, the head of the LLC live in Methuen and say that that's his primary residence.
right. But a corporation could own multiple houses, but a different person in the corporation could be designated as the operator as long as they lived in those various units. That would be okay.
If they live there, then
Yeah.
that they would have to get that through licensing.
Right. Okay. I don't know if this is a clarification. I just wondered if there was a need to define bedroom, since that's used as one of the qualifications. Just wondering, it's not in our list here, but is that defined in another place? Perhaps.
We did not define bedroom, so if you so choose to recommend that, we'll take that in advisement.
Okay, so a person that had a 3-bedroom house could set up a cot in their dining room and then rent out three of the bedrooms and say they're as a share, since they're there sleeping in the dining room.
They would have to have that. They would have to get through the building inspection part of the licensing agreement.
Right, I see that. Yeah, that would be something that would be put before the licensing.
Right. So
part of it.
so in your particular case, they could have 3 bedrooms, sleep in 1 bedroom, rent 2 bedrooms and the couch, and it should be legal.
Okay.
Is that it, Alden, for now?
Yeah, I think the rest of questions aren't clarifications, so I'll hold that off.
Okay, thank you. Other questions for clarification from planning board members?
I see Mr. Yep.
Bob, yeah.
Yes, hi, thanks. Just, I mean, reading the suggested language, it's clear that fundamental to the spirit of this is, in terms of no adverse impact on the neighborhood, is really direct owner involvement in the properties. And
Yes.
when I read the language, obviously in a home share rental unit, it's not possible for the owner to be present because they're renting out their house. But in limited share rental units and in owner adjacent units, it would seem that you would want to have the owner present during the rental of the unit so that they carry forward with that responsibility to their neighbors and to the neighborhood. And when I read the language around the owner adjacent unit, you qualify as an owner occupant if you're there for 183 days a year, but you're allowed to rent that adjacent unit anytime during the year, which leads to the potential for that unit being rented for almost 6 months without the owner being present. So I would really want to see some language added that requires the owner to be present in owner adjacent units when the unit is rented, as well as you have included it in the limited share rental unit.
Okay, thank you.
So I think that's the spirit of what you're trying to get at with the overall language here.
Sure. Thank you for pointing that out.
Yeah.
I think we'll take steps to close that potential loophole.
Thank you.
Any other questions for clarification or comments at this point? Because we will have time to add any additional ideas or adjustments after public comment. All right, Councillor Shand, I send it back to you.
Any questions amongst the committee?
Not this time.
Councillor Wallace?
None at this time.
All right, so shall we take public comment then?
Yes, I'd like to give some instruction for public comment.
Well, one second. I do
Yes.
see Councillor Khan's hand is up. Councillor Khan, do you have a question?
Yeah, also clarification, if that's okay.
Yes.
I don't think this is committee of the whole, but just to follow up on that last kind of point. I do want to, first of all, thank you so much for walking through this to Councilor McCauley. The primary residence definition of 183 days, if I'm not mistaken, did you say that was from Massachusetts general law?
Yes.
Okay, got it. And so that okay, I get it. So that's kind of the parameter with which that number came from. And one of the things I do want to point out as you kind of take these comments to heart is that if that said owner is not there, but they may have someone who's not quite the owner on record that is there for some of the year, whether it's a relative or something, that might be something. I don't know if you could capture that in whatever kind of adjustment you make, but I do wonder if it's either the owner or someone operating under the owner's, gosh, there must be a better word for it, but under their instructions or something like that. So I just wanted to add that.
Okay, thank you. We have tackled that in the general ordinance. It's usually called a owner's agent.
Oh, that's it. I knew there was a term. Thank you.
And we've defined that, and there are some limitations on this, but from a zoning perspective, I understand the potential gap here. So thank you.
All right, if there are no further comments from counselors, Andy, let's take public comment.
All right, and may I give some advice to the public for their comments to be helpful to us?
Yes, please.
Okay, so we do want to hear your comments in general, but from previous discussion within the planning board anyway, and this is just our perspective, we are particularly interested in hearing where you want to see short-term rentals allowed in the city and where not, and why. That would really help us in our deliberations after public comment closes. And the second, you've already heard some comments about the definitions, which is of high importance to us. And we would like to hear further if there are any concerns or recommendations on the definitions and the various distinctions of short-term rental unit. I was going to say this is going to be a by right ordinance, which would give the zoning administrator marching orders to determine whether someone meets the requirements and then is eligible to go for licensing. I heard Councilor McCauley suggest that there might be special permits for some districts in the city. So I'm not going to push that at this point.
Chair, that was only suggested that as an option. I tried to sprinkle in with the ordinance some areas that we've already, the co-sponsor and I have said, we'd be open to, more critical thought on that.
Good, then that's great. So we do want to hear people comment on that as well, whether it should be totally by right or either permitted or not permitted in the table of uses, or if special permits in certain districts should be considered. So we'll go forward with that. Please remember to give us your name and your address and limit your comments to no more than 2 minutes. Thank you.
And as the chairs have noted, just raise your hand using Zoom's tool. I notice we have 2 callers. If you'd like to raise your hand, I think you can press *9 to let us know that. First person we have is Jane Snow.
Jane Snow, 9 Cofford Street. First, I want to thank Councilor McCauley for all his hard work on this, and I know he's trying desperately to make sure that all the I's are dotted and T's are crossed and that we're covered in this. I am still very concerned about having short-term rentals in an R2 district. I think people have purchased homes in that area because of the fact that businesses are not allowed. And this, with all the definitions, is a very complex issue. And unless we have really great enforcement, this is going to be hard to keep track of, and how many days have they used it and so forth and so on. So I really think that this has to be looked at very, very carefully to protect the people that have had the pleasure of having their neighborhood home in a neighborhood. Thanks.
Other comments? I don't see any other hands right now.
If I could, Chairs, I just want to extend an opportunity to Craig Holt in the audience. I don't know, he's the Licensing Commission Chair. I didn't see his hand raised, but Craig, did you want to address the board or committee at all?
I would like to say something, yes. And it's based upon something that Councilman McCauley was talking about, and that was, I'm sorry, not McCauley, there was a gentleman from the planning board who was talking about bedroom. And my concern is, he gave an example of a 3-bedroom house and letting all 3 of them out and having the owner sleep on a couch somewhere in the house. I don't think that's correct. I think you have to look at the field card with the city of Newburyport that stipulates how many beds are in the house, and that is going to determine how many bedrooms you can let out, that you can allow people to sleep in, and one of those people would be the owner of the house. Hello?
Yes, thank you. That's great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I think otherwise you're violating what they have. And if, God forbid, there's a concern where there's an accident in the house and an insurance policy comes into play, I don't think the city wants to be in a situation where we're brought into litigation because we allowed a license to be issued and it was improperly used.
Thank you.
You're welcome. That's what I have to say thus far.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Craig.
Mr. Holt. Is there anyone else?
Not seeing any more. We do have one more. Jenny Donahue.
Hi, I just wanted to quickly just say that I think that this has been well thought out. I think that we need to have something in place where there's nothing in place currently. And I think with the couple of comments tonight, you pretty much nailed it. And I think that it's been really thoughtfully planned, and I appreciate all the work that everyone's put into it. And I just wanted to say that. Thanks.
Thank you. Are there any other folks who'd like to speak?
I'm not seeing any hands.
Looks like that's it, Chairs.
All right. So why don't we close public comment and bring it back into the committee and the planning board?
Would you mind if we started the discussion? Would that be all right?
Yes, let's go right ahead.
Okay, I'd like to focus the first part of the discussion on specific districts where it's permitted. We've had some discussion on the planning board, and our preference anyway, if I can speak for everybody, is to have it either permitted or not permitted and no special permits. You get into special permits and then it's why them and why not us and so on and so forth. I think we've been through that on the first round last year and the year before when we were discussing this. And we felt that it was just much more straightforward and would be very difficult to issue special permits without parameters that would lead us to even more detailed considerations before this could be approved. So I think the first round on this discussion should be why a special permit has been suggested from Councilor McCauley, and board members, I'd like you to chime in as well. And then the second part of it, and you can incorporate this together, is where it is permitted and where it's not permitted. But first, I'm a little curious on behalf of the planning board. why a special permit was considered even an option for R2 and R3.
It was simply to make the residential abutters. So it was suggested that the residential abutters might have even more visibility than what we've asking for into having a unit like this go in. I think you hit it on the head, is that we would prefer to have it permitted, which is why we went with that. But if you were trying to talk us into going to special permit, then we'd be open to that.
Any planning board member want to put special permit on that? I think you got the message there. Bob, did you want to speak?
I was just going to say, I think the licensing process kind of runs parallel with what might have been a special permit review. So I think that individual review does take place, but it's in the licensing arena, not special permit environment. So I think it's still being addressed in a way.
Yeah. Okay. Back to comments about where it is or is not permitted. I'd like comments from other members. Rick.
Thanks. Well, I guess one question that comes up to me, one of the things that people are concerned about, or two of the things that people are most concerned about in terms of impacts, have to do with noise and parking congestion. And with that in mind, I wonder why we are allowing these in the more densely settled parts of the city, the R2 and R3, and not in the R1. It would seem to me that when you have a larger lot and you've got wider streets, there's less impact on parking and more ability to control noise. So not that I have a strong feeling about it, but it just seems that the two districts that were proposed, two residential districts we're proposing it are the more densely settled areas. And it would seem to make sense that if it's okay for the R2, it's probably even better for the R1. There's even less impact. So that was just one question. And an unrelated question is, and I've brought this up before, is the conflicting regulations, especially between short-term rental and bed and breakfast. And I know there's a sentence that has been added to the definition of residential unit that says it shall not include any other use in the zoning ordinance. But that doesn't, I think, resolve the question of if somebody proposes a bed and breakfast, particularly in an B1 district, where it's allowed by special permit, and in order to get the same type of use that would otherwise be allowed as a short-term rental unit. I guess just want to again recognize that. I think there are two easy ways to resolve this by adding language.
Excuse me. I'm sorry, I've let you go on too long. I kind of wanted to keep things on the first topic.
I thought I was talking about districts, but that's fine.
No, I was just the first table that was up previously.
Yeah,
would you mind?
right.
This is really important and we will get to it. But it may make it a little easier if we can resolve where the uses should be located, and then this will be in that context.
Okay.
Thanks so much. Okay. I don't know who wants to respond to his first comment about
I guess it's me, right?
yeah, right.
So, well, it was pretty easy. That's where the short-term rentals are. There's 125 of them in R2 and R3 today, and there's one in R1. So that's where people want to be. Our housing stock has gone to, smaller units, et cetera. and in R1, they're not walking distance to downtown. Nothing more than that.
Anyone want to comment on that response? Alden, I see your hand up. Is that to respond to what Councilor McCauley said?
I can respond to that, but I also support the question about why it's not allowed in R1. Again, why penalize the people in R1, prevent them from doing this? Just if someone wants to be further from town, just having the ability to walk to town doesn't seem that it's not as close to downtown, doesn't seem like a reasonable thing to prevent someone from being allowed to do this. I also wonder why it's not necessarily allowed in R1. In addition to R1, B1. There are some residential areas there. And again, you're not allowing people to have the freedom to do this. For example, the new buildings in Boston Way are in the B1. And what you're saying is that someone has a unit there, they wouldn't be allowed to do this. So I'm not sure why that was excluded. Again, also the High Street sections, again, the residential sections there. Why are you preventing people who do own homes there not to be allowed to do this as other people in the R2 and R3 would be allowed? I saw in the licensing also that it said that law was not recommending having it in the R1, and I didn't really know why they were recommending that, if there was any information on that as well. Thanks.
So again, the answer for R1 was simply there wasn't a demand for it. And when we had unrestricted access, the market dictated where it was, right? And so if your recommendation is to continue to add R1, then we'll take that as a recommendation and why. In terms of B1, the example you used at 1 Boston Way is exactly why B1's excluded. The whole idea here is that we're trying to preserve our housing stock, not allow people to, rent out, take them off the permanent housing stock and create short-term adventures for folks, as opposed to having long-term housing stock here. So it's one of the reasons that we did that. But again, glad to hear the conversation and your recommendation.
Other planning board members on response to what Alden had said, or your own ideas about where this should be allowed or not allowed? I'll comment. Just because there aren't any right now in R1 doesn't mean that the one where you can rent out your entire home while you go away on vacation and make some money to fund your vacation shouldn't be allowed. So I think there is that particular type of rental that we would be restricting people in R1 from allowing them to do. So I would be in favor of allowing it in R1.
I see Councilor Tantar's hand is up as well, I think, to answer that one or speak to it. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Chair Sontag.
I'm done.
Yeah, I was just, I'm a co-sponsor. I was just going to reiterate and support what Councilor McCauley said, not regarding location on R1. I think that again is what we would be looking for your advice. But in particular, with regard to 1 Boston Way, which are rental units already, all right? So, I mean, you're not going to have limited, well, I guess you could have limited share rental there if you wanted to allow it. But they're rental units to start with, and we'd like to keep them rental units. And I suppose I guess the question you're asking is whether or not we would want to encourage rental units in B1 to also be short-term rentals. And yeah, I would like to hear your recommendation on that.
Zoning Administrator Blanchet, her hand is up.
Yes,
Jennifer?
I have 2 comments. One, first off, is that the Boston Way development is, I don't believe it's actually in the B1 zoning district entirely. I think it's just outside of it in an overlay. I would want to confirm that. But additionally, those units, I believe, are deed restricted to not allow the short-term rental. And therefore, if we could have the conversation more generally about the B1, the other areas of the B1, for instance, at the traffic circle and by the Market Basket and Shaw's Plazas, that might be a simpler way to address it rather than confusing it with the Boston Way project, which I believe is already deed restricted.
Are there other comments supporting a change in B1? Okay, so we'll leave that. Is there any support for Alden's suggestion on the planning board anyway? Or do you want to leave it? Rick?
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I mean, and without looking at the actual housing stock along State Street, for example, I think that's the area that would be most likely to have an interest in short-term rentals, and it's adjacent to, it's surrounded by the residential districts that allow it. So, I mean, when I come back to my other point, that's also about B1, but I'll save that for later. But I think Alden's point is very good here on State Street.
Do the counselors want to speak to this? Counselor Wallace? Counselor Eigenman?
Yeah, I mean, I think before the planning board votes, if it's okay, I'd like to have the other counselors talk about it too. Just the use table, going from left to right, from what I've heard tonight and thought about and comments from the public, I do see the logic in keeping everything either not permitted or permitted, a bright line rule. For 2 reasons. One is, well, what would be the basis of a special permit in R2? And also there's a whole general ordinance licensing procedure. However, what I do think the quid pro quo for that is you have to have explicit parking regulations. So I know I won't get into that now because we're just talking about the areas, but I'm saying I would support allowing it by right in R2 if the zoning has parking restrictions. And then by the same token, I agree with some of the board members that there's really no reason, even though the market right now is not demanding short-term rentals in R1, so long as they have enough parking and they meet all these other rules about having someone on site and so on, I would be in favor of allowing it by right there. And then finally, in the High Street residential district, we didn't hear from everyone on that one, but same thing. If they meet all of the other regulations on parking and so on, I'm not concerned necessarily about preserving that housing stock. I'd like to hear arguments both ways on that. On the B1, I think the way out of this wrestling hold is actually just to forbid it in the smart growth district. That's how I would do it. Because, whether it's B1 or actually, I think One Boston Way, as Jennifer Blanchet was saying, is in an I-1B zone. It's a sort of quasi-industrial zone. But the point is, we don't want to mix short-term, or I don't want to mix short-term rental with the smart growth district, so that just as there are deed restrictions, I just don't want to allow it at all. Because what we're trying to get there is rental housing that's at least 20% affordable. Thank you.
Any other comments from counselors? I see Counselor Wallace.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to say, this has come a long way in the last year and a half. So I think it started before the pandemic. And a lot of these decisions in terms of what we want here or there, it's just it's a policy question. And when counselors go to vote on it, it's going to be very interesting. They each bring their own experiences to the table and they hear from different residents. So it's not necessarily that one's right, what's wrong, but we'll see how that goes on the floor. But what is interesting to me is, I haven't been as involved with kind of the detailed discussions over the past year. And I feel like when we first started this, it was much more strict. And then we started getting feedback from residents who have Airbnbs. So to hear people in favor of R1 or having them everywhere seems like a shift. And maybe I'm wrong, and maybe that's because we've got more information, we've got the licensing piece of it more, it's like a tighter process there. So I guess I'm a little surprised that R1 is being thrown out there. I mean, again, it's kind of what do you feel comfortable with as a counselor when you're voting? But I'd be interested to hear from Counselor McCauley or Counselor Chantar on if they have seen a shift over the past year and why it's being more allowed in certain locations. I'm just curious. Thank you.
Counselor McCauley.
Yeah, so I'll answer that if I can. Actually, when we first started, we were looser on the zoning and stricter on licensing. And what we heard through testimony is that we need a better balance. We need some structure in zoning. And so actually these have tightened up. The zoning regs have tightened up quite a bit. The choice for R1 was simply a large volume of folks said, in conversation that they didn't think R1 was good. And I think you're right. It is a policy decision. I'm not stuck on that. I think that we can allow, personally, I think we can allow it in R1 and regulate it in step 2, right? And step 1 is it available and do you qualify? And step 2 is, are you going to take the next step and register with the state and do the things that have to be done to run it as a business? And so we have come a long way in educating folks as to the impact, good and bad. We have good hosts and bad hosts, and good and bad that these types of commercial units, and that's what they are, right? Is have in the neighborhood. They do impact the neighborhood. Every rental impacts the neighborhood, period. You can argue whether it's good or bad, and whether the bad, is outweighed by, benefits to people who don't live here, right? But I think that what we're coming back to is as you mentioned, the policy piece as to what do we want our housing stock to look like, and we have residences and we have rentals, and if we keep taking our rentals and allowing folks to make them, hotel rooms, then we don't have rentals and we don't have that mix anymore.
Chair Shane,
Thank
may
you.
I follow up with a question?
Certainly.
So I know this gets into licensing a bit, but since we have the zoning administrator here, realistically, how capable or what is the capacity for the city to enforce these? Say it goes into R1. Are we really going to be able to enforce what we need to? Are we set up for that? I don't know who can answer that question, but just I think it's an important piece.
If Councilor Macaulay could speak to at least the plan as far as
Yep.
administering first.
Yeah, so the enforcement and administration of this is in conjunction with a third party. And the third party does this work for, it would be a paid engagement for us. The third party does this work for City of Boston, Somerville, New Bedford, about 200 cities or so on the West Coast, all very similar to Newburyport in terms of what they do. They are there to handle the first call of enforcement, from residents. If they see something askew, they can call, they can text, they can send video, and that will be sent to the record of the emergency contact, and that will need to be resolved. Any of those issues will need to be resolved within 30 minutes. And if not, then it gets referred to the police appropriately, et cetera, whatever department there is. So that's an important step. The flip side, the part B of that is that the same entity basically proactively scans all of the online websites and pulls out these rentals that are identified within the community that they use, and they match it up to the database that we will be creating with our residential. So they will know, for example, how many days that, and they can advise us how many days a unit has been on the market or has actually been rented, or things like that. So we think it's a good 1-2 punch that will supplement the work being done by planning as well as any of the other boards.
Hello?
I do see Councillor Tantar's hand up, and then after that, I see Councillor Connell's hand up.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to respond to Councilor Wallace's impression from her memory that it used to be stricter in the first version. So I'm referring to the 7/22/2020 zoning. And in that, in conservation area, it was allowed by special permit. In the high street residential areas, it was allowed by permit, 1 by permit, 2 by permit, 3 by permit. B1 was not permitted, B2 and B3 by permit. Waterfront marine dependent was by special permit, and waterfront marine use was by permit. So actually it's the exact opposite. This zoning is much more strict than the zoning of about 1.5 years ago. Thank you.
So Councillor Connell, before I allow you to speak, I just want to make sure that this is committee of the whole beforehand, because we've already had 2, Councillor Tantar and Councillor Khan speak, and no, it is not posted as committee of the whole. So apologize for that.
I thought it was.
It's not posted online as committee of the whole. It's in our packet as committee of the whole. Let's just double check. Checking right now.
It's up to you. I mean, you're the chair.
Yes, Chair Shand, I could refrain from speaking for the rest of the time and defer.
Sorry, you've already spoken.
Oh, okay. How about if I leave? Should I?
Nope.
Doesn't work that way. Sorry.
Okay.
Yep. Sorry. Sorry, Counselor Connell.
That's okay. I can go eat dinner now. But thank you for your consideration. I'll hold until we get to the floor.
Okay.
Well, could I speak again?
Go right ahead.
So I thought of a reason of why not to do on High Street, and it's from something that the zoning administrator had said in the past, which is we also have had problems with sort of wedding events and other events, and the bigger properties seem to attract that. So I can see why actually in the High Street, if you open that up for short-term rental, you may be opening the door to de facto, wedding events. And we've had a problem with that on Merrimack, I think, in Councillor Wallace's ward. So I can see the argument there.
Counselor Wallace, I see your hand up.
Sure. Yes, Councilor Igerman just said what I was going to say. We currently have an issue with the wedding venue on Merrimack. I mean, you've got the river views and all that. So that's my concern with, some of that. Thanks.
Counselor McCauley, is there any restrictions that would occur that would prevent that from the licensing and permitting standpoint?
Yes.
Well, I think Councilor Tonto just answered that, so.
Sorry. It's all over the license.
Just wanted it. Okay,
That's
just wanted to make sure it was answered in this venue.
It's the number of people and that kind of stuff. And that's the two-step process we're trying to get to. Yeah.
Okay. Counselor Khan, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Shand. I think with what I'm hearing then with the licensing portion of that, do you think some of the concerns raised here regarding the High Street as well as R1 districts, could they be resolved through licensing to ensure kind of what are some of the concerns so that we could loosen the zoning and have those be permitted as an option? And I think that's going to be an important part of this is the two of these working together to make sure it prevents detrimental situations, I think, for residents and abutters.
Quick answer is yes. Our attempt is trying to make it simplified as we roll it out. And, that's why we went with this. If the feedback is to loosen that up, then, we will be more than open to that. But to your question, can the second step be a critical factor in controlling some things? Yes. And does it make it more easier or harder to enforce? It's all the same. Enforcement is enforcement.
All right, further questions?
Well, can we move on to other parts of the ordinance?
Yes, Chair Sontag, do you have
Yes.
anything else you want to address on this section, or do you want to move on?
Let's move on. And since Rick introduced it, could we now move to the section looking at districts where we allow bed and breakfast and lodging houses and make sure there are no conflicts there?
All right, let's move on.
So Rick, can you introduce us again to this, please?
Well, actually, I think it's broader than that. This is the analysis that I did, but I think that, I would suggest that we basically allow short-term rentals in any district where we allow single family by right or by special permit. The only reason I was focusing on the bed, and so that would be, conservation, High Street, residential 1, et cetera, et cetera. The only reason I was focusing on this was because we seem to have built into the proposed regulation a conflict where in some cases, short-term rental unit is more restrictive than bed and breakfast. In some cases, it's less restrictive than bed and breakfast. And there doesn't seem to be a reason for that. And so I was suggesting either that we say that short-term rental unit trumps bed and breakfast, or that we say whatever is the least restrictive regulation applies. So we're not taking away existing rights. But I think that, again, it's it relates to that other discussion about zoning districts. And I think it could be, I think you'd have to address the conflicts one way or the other, either by saying that whichever is more restrictive applies, whichever is least restrictive applies, or that short-term rental unit always governs whenever there's a conflict.
What would be the complications with this, Councilor Macaulay, given that you've been?
There aren't really any complications. I think personally, I'm waiting for you guys to tell me how you want to resolve this, right? And I mean, this has been an issue that you guys have brought up that is an issue. And I'm not sure we necessarily see it in practice, but you guys are the zoning experts. So whatever you recommend that we do to resolve this conflict, I don't know that there's a bed and breakfast that's somebody's permanent house, right? That's their primary residence, necessarily that would conform through the licensing to get that, right? Or conversely for a lodging house. But where those are, we'd like to clearly state that, as a line item that says, a short-term rental is not a lodging house and is not a bed and breakfast, and whatever language you propose, I think we'd be open to.
So Councillor Eigenman wants to speak 1 second.
Yeah, I think what Councillor Macaulay just said is the solution, which is that, the definitions are meant to be mutually exclusive, and we should say that, and that'll do it, because there is a definition of bed and breakfast that's very specific. It's an owner occupied building, not a lot, but a building, and it can't have any more than 5 rooming units, not including the quarters for the owner occupant. It's not supposed to have individual cooking facilities. So again, it's its own animal. And, we have situations all the time in town and zoning where the zoning administrator or the building inspector, depending what city or town you're in, it's up to them to decide what a use is. An applicant always says, well, I think it's and I do this for clients in Boston all the time. I think it's this, but it's not up to the applicant. It's up to the government to tell them which category they're in. And if we say you have to, if we put in the clarification that it's one or the other, it's fine. And also, I don't agree that they're all the same, that a bed and breakfast and a short-term rental and Airbnb are the same animal. I think they have different impacts. They're a different type of business venture. And they, I did look at the use table just now when Rick mentioned it to see what it says for bed and breakfast. And I wouldn't change anything about bed and breakfast. I think we have it in the right, allowed in the correct zones and not in the wrong ones. So for example, we were talking about wedding events that want to be near the Merrimack River. Well, if it's in the waterfront mixed use zone, I think by special permit, you can do a bed and breakfast so that we can evaluate that type of business. And, they would be allowed to do weddings at a bed and breakfast. So I don't think they're the same. And I think they have different impacts and different implications also for our housing stock. So I think we're okay on that. I do, since we're moving off of the use table though, I think the chains are off, and I can say, I don't think it's even allowed for us to just kick all parking regulations to the general ordinance. There's actually a case on this where the court found that you had to do overnight off-street parking regulation by zoning. It's out of Barnstable about 10 years ago. And they invalidated the general law and said you can only do the parking reg under zoning because, and they gave reasons. They said, you know, you already cover parking historically. You've done it for many years in your zoning. And they didn't buy also that it was a public health issue. They're like, it's not a public health issue, it's a zoning issue. So I think the safer course is, for legal reasons, is to make sure that we have the parking reg in here. But also, I think it serves the concerns that many have. There are most of the city is R2. That's to say, most of the built part of the city. It's actually, we have more R2, two-family, than we have single-family, which is unusual. But so that means there's a good bit of variety in our R2. If you're in an R2 way out in, you know, the north end, it may be a lot easier to park than on Fruit Street or Fair Street. So that's why I'm really pushing. If I'm going to vote for a by right, we have to have the parking regulations in here.
Planning board members, response, please. I don't want to be the only one speaking. Let's start with, I'm going to put Rick on the spot to try to wrap up this bed and breakfast lodging house issue. Is it sufficient in your mind to just say that it is not a short-term rental and let the definitions stand as they are in the rest of the zoning ordinance?
It seems to me that a bed and breakfast overlaps with a limited share rental unit. Renting out units, renting out a room in an owner-occupied house. So it seems vague to me. I don't know. I'm not sure how you can define them in such a way that one excludes the other. There may be a way, but I haven't figured that one out. So I guess that's my big concern, is that there seems that the limit, you know, if we at one point had talked about having separate lines in the use table for home share, limited share, and owner adjacent, and then you could have different regulations and you could match up the limited share with bed and breakfast. But since we're grouping them all together, it does seem that there's a direct correlation between limited share rental unit and bed and breakfast. So that's why I think we just need to say something about it in the ordinance. I think we can do it. I don't think it's hard to do, but I think we need to say something about it in the ordinance.
And do you have a suggestion about what that is to say?
Yes, well, actually I had two suggestions, two alternatives. One was, you know, where a short-term rental use would also conform to the description of a lodging house or a bed and breakfast. The provisions of the table of use regulations relating to, or to essentially the short-term rental units, use number 111, would apply. So that would basically say the short-term rental unit governs whenever there's a conflict. And the alternative one, that would actually make it more restrictive for some uses than it is right now for lodging house and bed and breakfast in some places. The alternative would be to say whatever is the least restrictive provision applies, and you could do either one. I don't really care. I don't think either one makes a difference. I think it's just you need to somehow address it.
And could we put this in section 5, ineligible residential units, listing it out? We list out, you know, affordable housing and subsidized homes and, you know, in-law apartments, and we could list this there as well with that terminology.
I think it would just go into section 4, either section 3 or section 4, either one. just to clarify, I think it makes more sense under section 3, under that table, just to say, here's the list of use regulations, and just have a footnote under it, basically saying whatever you want, whether you say this applies or where you say this, where there's an overlap, the least restrictive one applies. And I think that's a policy question, but it's not an important policy question. It just clarifies any potential ambiguity. And again, I think it only affects limited share rental units. But the other two aren't affected.
Sure, understood.
Great. So I think we've put that one to bed. Let's move on to parking, because we have also been concerned about parking. And I'm glad Councilor Eigenman brought it up as a serious consideration. First of all, the wording here, I believe, is a bit messed up. It doesn't make sense. But I'm also wondering if we can tighten it up a little bit with maybe another sentence.
Bonnie, can I interrupt just for 1 second?
Sure.
To go back to the point that we were making about the distinction between the short-term rental unit and the lodging house and bed and breakfast. I think saying that it would be the least restrictive, my concern is if you're treating it as a limited share rental, there's a maximum for 3 bedrooms and 6 guests, which I think would cap it as lower than what's allowed under a bed and breakfast. So I'm just wondering, are there licenses granted for lodging houses and bed and breakfasts? And obviously there will be for short-term rental units. I'm wondering if through the licensing, if we define them somehow, the owner can identify through the licensing project process what they want to be classified as.
Could I speak on that? So the table of uses we have on bed and breakfast, there is no by right bed and breakfast. Everything's either a special permit or it's not permitted. So here's what a lawyer is going to do. They're going to say, well, if I can fit it into short-term rental, then I'm going to go for that because it's by right and it's cheaper to my client. So that, let's be practical here. I mean, we don't really need to go through all this because we know what's going to happen. Everyone's going to go to Jennifer Blanchet and say, I'm not a bed and breakfast, and actually a short-term rental. So long as our short-term rental regulations say what we want them to say, I think that's okay. I don't, we have the situation where you have hundreds of conceivable uses and the city has to decide which one it is. I mean, it comes up every day, all the time. And, you don't really have to worry about, complying with the least restrictive or the more restrictive. The zoning administrator or the building inspector decides what use it is. And then those regulations apply. That's it. That's how you do it.
Jennifer, your hand's up.
I think Councillor Eigenman just sort of clarified what I was hoping would be clarified, in that the applicant's always going to look for the least, the path of least resistance. And in least as, if I were the one looking at it, if they qualified as small 3-bedroom bed and breakfast could qualify as a short-term rental unit with whatever added parking regulations we may be adding in, it would qualify as just that, a short-term rental unit, and it would not have to carry the special permit process. So despite, I do see Rick's concern that something might be able to be characterized as both. We do see that or at least sometimes in the zoning ordinance, and the path of least resistance is the one that gets followed.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Okay, are we wrapped up on this topic now?
think we are.
Okay, moving on to parking. What would people like to see to beef up the parking statement under, what is this? 4G. Do we want to link it to number of bedrooms? Do we want to find other categories that require it to distinguish it, building on what Jennifer just said, from a bed and breakfast?
Counselor Eigenman?
Well, I mean, just the way here's how we do it for traditional hotel-like things. So as Chair Sontag said, a hotel or an inn, it's one per guest bedroom. Very simple. That's what we've always expected. So, that seems like a pretty safe way to go with short-term rental if they're essentially the same thing. For bed and breakfast, it says 2 spaces plus 1 space per guest room. I don't think you need to do that if again, we've already, the sponsors already defined eligible units as being residential units. So they already went through a zoning process to figure out their parking. So I don't think tacking on another 2 spaces makes sense personally. And then for lodging houses, that came up too. I don't want to ignore that. But by the way, lodging houses are just like bed and breakfast in that there's no such thing as a by right lodging house. You always have to get a special permit. So again, lawyers are always going to try and do the short-term rentals. They don't have to do that. It also says 1 per guest bedroom. So it looks like, the pattern has been 1 per guest bedroom. I don't know what the sponsors feel about that, but it seems reasonable to me. And then if you're in a tight area, like downtown, there is an alternative way of complying by identifying parking in public spaces, public lots or garages, or, you can pay a fee, or, within a certain distance, you can lease a space from a neighbor. So it's not impossible, but, there's a process. And then other parts of the South End, that's going to be a limitation. People are not going to be able to rent out a 5-bedroom house for, Airbnb unless they can come up with 5 parking spaces that they probably don't have right now. So that's a good way to regulate this, I think. I mean, just thinking ahead as a ward councilor, the complaints that we're going to get, unfortunately, the car dominates everything, and that's what we're going to get. So I would propose per guest bedroom, but I mean, what does the planning board think?
Members, anybody want to speak up?
I will. It's MJ. I guess I agree with Jared. I think that, people aren't going to be able to, if you have a 5-bedroom, they can't get 5 spots. I do have a concern for the dense part of the South End, that it takes up spots that are, well, I mean, we're restricted also already. So maybe it's not an issue, but I pretty much agree with Jared. One per bedroom seems to make the most sense to me.
And of course, just to clarify, we're assuming what's already written here will be adhered to, that they will provide off-street, on or off-site parking to accommodate all uses. We're just clarifying now that means 1 car per guest bedroom. And that's what they have to provide for when they go for their license. They have to prove that.
Chair, just a point of clarification is we have this language in the licensing side that they have to provide a plan for off-site parking, right? And either, off-street, on or off-street, but off-site type of parking. That plan is nebulous because as, and purposely not defined because parking is a zoning issue. And so just to validate, as a sponsor, I'm okay with 1 per, if that's what folks would like to go with.
Bob, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I'm also okay with the one per bedroom, but I guess I'm very concerned about enforcement of that, because you can identify, if you don't have room on your particular property, you can identify off-site locations. But if I'm a renter, I'm still going to park in front of where I'm renting and, just be in and out as quickly as I can. So I just wonder how this gets enforced. And, I continue to refer back to the owners being present when units are being rented, but this also falls on the neighbors. So I just am concerned that when a property requires off-site parking because there just isn't enough room, I don't know how you enforce that. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I'll jump in on that. Spent a lot of time on this. So the only part of the city where you can have off-site parking, except by variance, is in the downtown overlay district within 300 feet of a city municipal lot. And then when we did look at liberalizing that distance in 2017, I think it was, and that failed at the city council. So 300 feet, we did a bunch of maps. I think Andy Port could probably dig them up. So it's really a very limited part of the city where you can do any off-site parking.
Rick?
Talking about the number of parking spaces, Councilor Eigenman referred to the bed and breakfast requirement, which is the 2 for the single family unit plus additional spaces per guest bedroom. And again, I'm coming back to limited share rental unit. If we just did 1 space per guest bedroom and we're renting out 3 bedrooms, then a single family house with 2, which would ordinarily require 2 spaces, would only require 3 spaces for the owner and 3 rental rooms. And I guess I would say for the limited share rental unit, you probably do want to have some spaces for the owner plus some for the rental units, the rental bedrooms. I think it's cleaner again for the home share rental units and the owner adjacent, but the limited share again, you could end up with some congestion by having 3 bedrooms rented plus the owners who are living there. Again, I think it's going to be tough to find those spaces, find properties that have all those spaces in the most congested areas, but it is something to think about.
Be very hard in the R2 district to, find properties that have enough room to accommodate the kind of parking we're talking about, which is why the off-site scenario would make sense to homeowners. But again, there's the enforcement question around it.
Alden?
Yeah, I was just going to say that would apply to owner adjacent as well, right? Not just the limited share, because I don't know that we would assume that there's 2 separate driveways on an owner adjacent. It could be just 1 driveway and the 2 buildings, right?
Or it's a two-family house and there's 1 driveway and there's parking to accommodate all of the cars that are required between the owner and the renters.
Heather?
So my question is, example, if you had a 3-bedroom home, but you only had room for 1 parking spot on the license, is it going to be stated then that it can rent out 1 bedroom? Because
They may never get a license because they can't provide adequate parking.
Or
in 1
could,
vehicle.
yeah, or couldn't
But
they
if
provide?
it was more direct renter, and
You're breaking up, sorry.
like, let's say I show up with my 3 children. Oh, can you hear me?
Right.
Can
Yeah.
you hear me now?
Yeah.
So my thought is that if it is a multiple bedrooms, but only 1 parking spot, are they able to rent those multiple bedrooms? As an example, like a parent and several children are renting for a weekend, they're coming in the same one vehicle. So that one vehicle fits in the parking space, but they need to occupy 2 bedrooms. Would that be allowed?
No. No, it would not.
So that's a problem.
I do see that as a problem.
Why wouldn't it be allowed?
You have to have sufficient parking based on the number of rooms that are being offered. So if on a particular weekend, there's a family that's sharing one car, that's nice. But, what happens the next weekend when you have 3 college kids in 3 different cars?
Yeah.
So the zoning is always written for the worst case in that situation. So, the same thing is true of hotels. People carpool to hotels sometimes, but the parking regulation is always based on the number of guest bedrooms. And then I think we're talking past ourselves on the underlying use. Remember, in order to do a residential unit is a defined term under this ordinance. It can only be use 101, use 102, or use 103, which is 1 family, 2 family, or multifamily. So it doesn't wipe out the parking requirement for those uses when you make part of it or all of it a short-term rental. You have to provide, you're not forgiven from your parking requirement for the underlying use. So what I was trying to say, I apologize if I was unclear, is that so in the South End, we do have houses today, many of them, that don't have off-street parking, but they're lawfully conforming because they've been lawful dwellings since before we adopted zoning. So I don't think it's fair, to make them also require parking for themselves. All we're caring about is the change, and the change is if they rent out to visitors. And so that's tied to the guest bedrooms. And similarly, say you do have off-street parking. I have a condo that has off-street parking. I can't just rent out, my unit and then, ignore the fact that I have that parking because I am complying right now. I still need those 2 spaces. That I should have been clear on that.
I'm wondering if all of this gets resolved through somebody's explanation that licensing requires a parking plan. And as part of the licensing process, wouldn't they be looking at your 3 bedrooms with no additional parking available locally off-site or on no additional parking available on site, and therefore you would have to buy a permit for parking in a facility or a parking lot, or show where they're going to be parked. So you can do it 1 per bedroom because that covers the time when 3 cars come for 3 bedrooms. And I'm just wondering if the licensing parking plan allows us to put this 1 parking space, however it is identified per guest room.
I don't think so. I really think because of this case out of Barnstable, the safe course is that it has to be done as a zoning ordinance, meaning it goes to the planning board and we have to vote it in by 2/3 supermajority on the city council. So what I'm suggesting is, we have Roman numeral 7-B, which is our parking requirement table. And, it says bed and breakfast, use 110, 2 spaces plus 1 space for each guest room. All I'm suggesting is that we add this new use to the table, short-term rental use, number 111, and say 1 space per each guest room, in addition to parking required for residential unit, if that's what you want.
But how do people meet that if they live in I'm just following up on some of the other comments that have been made. There's
That's exactly my point, is I'm saying if in the if you were just going to limit this to the R3, maybe I could see voting for it without any parking requirement, maybe. I'm not sure, I'm not saying that. But in the R2, I can't do that unless I know that there's sufficient parking, because I'll be bequeathing to Jenny Donahue, the next city councilor for Ward 2, a disaster where she's going to get constant complaints about parking. Now that's my point.
I see Don's hand is up.
Yeah, sorry.
No, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on the definition of offsite. Does everyone feel that's explicitly clear in this zoning ordinance, not in the licensing? And again, I would like to think that we could also agree on a certain distance, because even if it was several hundred feet, I know what's going to happen. They're still going to just park in the street, but at least we've limited how far they can go to be defined as offsite. Whether it's a private, they get some agreement with someone else, and to rent something, but it's really never used. That's my concern. Again, it's in the south end. I just see the parking, and I know some of the other councilors as well as planning board members have addressed that. And I guess I'm a little leery of, putting that in the licensing committee. If we could somehow make it a bit more restrictive with respect to what's the definition or how far the distance is for offsite. Thank you.
Okay, Heather?
Yes.
Your hand is up. Did you want to say something?
No, sorry, that's unintentional. Sorry.
So we haven't really resolved this unless I've missed the point.
Well, I'm sorry, but I think we have a way out based on the recent reform. So in 2020, the zoning law was amended, and it clarified that it's section 9 as to special permits in Massachusetts. And it says that by special permit, you can allow reduced parking spaces for residential unit ratio requirements. So maybe the way forward, if the board wants to, you could allow off-site parking by special permit. I can see that, but I'm just stating my position from representing downtown in the South End. I cannot vote for by right short-term rentals where there's off-site parking that's more liberal than what we have downtown, which was a hard battle. It has to be on-site, or if you guys want to cook up a special permit procedure, you could do that too. But otherwise, it's just going to create, I believe, a real conflict in the neighborhood for all the reasons that you've heard, including if you let people say, well, I have a deal, 1,000 feet away with my friend, no one's going to use that. They're just going to park in the street. And that's going to fall to the Ward 2 councilor and the city and the parking clerk. And they're going to ask you to repeal the ordinance.
Counselor McCauley?
Yeah, I think you lost me here at the end, right? So, and so I have some questions. So I think that, that one per bedroom, I think is realistic. And I guess I'm lost between the on-site and off-site, right? Because many places in the city don't have on-site, and they have on-street parking as their plan, right? So we've consistently said that you've got to find an alternative to the on-street parking in front of your house. So do we have a problem with, or I guess I don't understand the problem that asking folks to come up with a plan, if they plan to run this business out of their home, to accommodate the extra requirement of parking, and whether they, park in our parking garage or make other accommodations. Those accommodations would have to be spelled out in their application and reviewed and approved as well, right? So zoning says one per, right? And then it's left to whether the applicant can actually meet that requirement or not. I guess it seems straightforward to me, but I'm asking what the other things I don't see are.
Well, the counselor, the difference is on-site versus off-site. That's the difference. So we're totally in line with each other on the fact that there are hundreds and hundreds of housing units in Newburyport that don't have any parking at all.
Yeah.
And that's fine, that's lawful. And this wouldn't change that. Just because they want to rent out rooms doesn't mean we're gonna reach back and say, haha, now you have to have parking for yourself. That's not fair. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is the off-site parking, we don't have that anywhere but downtown right now. And we debated that a few years ago, and it went nowhere. We couldn't even get the distance lengthened from 300 feet. So what you're suggesting is pretty revolutionary, that you would allow a short-term rental to have off-site parking, so the units on Spring Street, but they identify some parking around the corner on Orange. We don't allow that for full-time year-round residents. So that doesn't seem right to me. And that's all I'm saying.
So, yeah, but on Orange, that in your example have they made arrangement with a private company, a private owner of the property, or are they identifying 2 streets away that's where they're going to park their car because no one parks their car there? And before you answer that is, we just approved an overnight parking permit for inns to park in our garage, right? So, is this a way that we can increase revenue into our parking fund by expanding that into our parking garage now?
But that's what I'm saying. I'm saying that's covered. That's downtown. You can do offsite parking in our parking garage. The liberalization we made was to allow it for inns, because residents were already allowed to do that. I'm not talking about downtown. That's not in dispute, and that's all R3. I'm talking about Spring Street's a really good example. There is no parking garage. It's so the arrangement would be with a private, a friend or a landlord around the block on Orange Street. And what I'm saying is we don't allow that now for any use whatsoever. You would be allowing it for short-term rentals the first time ever. And if the board wants to do that and recommend it, and the council wants to do it, I can see that. It's a policy argument, as Councilor Wallace was saying. It's not like it's a crime against humanity. It's a policy argument, but it's at odds with what we do for just normal residential. We don't allow that.
Okay, thank you for the clarification.
Don?
Yes, thank you. Just to follow up on that point again with respect to Councilor Eigenman's clarification. If there was no, if the short-term rental units were not allowed in the downtown district, would you agree, or would everyone agree that then we could strike off-site parking? Yes, off-site parking. Because if I understood you correctly, Councilor Eigenman, the only place this is allowed is downtown. So
that's
I
right.
just want to be sure if this is on Federal Street, it is impossible to allow for the licensing board to allow any off-site parking for an application. In fact, it would not even be approved to go to the licensing board because the zoning enforcement officer would decline it. Is my understanding on that correct?
That's the way we do it today for every other use. You cannot institute any new use on Federal Street without on-site parking unless you get a variance. That's correct. And so so you're asking the question of your colleagues.
Okay, thank you.
And I would respond with, why not? I don't think either I don't understand or I just simply don't agree with Councillor Igerman that this is an exception that shouldn't be considered. I think it should be for short term because the owners are already grandfathered into wherever they're parking on the street. But the short-term rental is a new use. And unless I don't understand it and I need some help with this, I would think that short-term rentals should be allowed to have off-street arrangements made that are part of their licensing plan in order to get licensed.
I guess, Bonnie, since I had raised this, is my answer to that is I guess I'm never political. I don't trust the owner operators to enforce that. They'll put something 3-4 streets their buddy or whatever it is. People will come in. There's 1 out of 100 that will follow those rules, in my opinion. So I'm just trying to prevent a whole bunch of complaints to the city councilors.
Well, it would be an enforcement issue. It would go through the process that Councillor Macaulay outlined. And yes, we know a lot of the initial calls will be coming from neighbors because they see what's happening. But if the owner of the short-term rental unit has a license that says where these people are to park and they're not using it, they're in violation of their license.
Again, I hear you theoretically, that's correct. I just personally don't buy the enforcement. I always think it's better to prevent even the potential for enforcement for prohibiting something. So yes, I'm generally more restrictive, but I understand there's two sides of the coin.
I just don't see how we can offer short-term rentals in parts of R2 in the south end, if that's the case.
You probably can't. That would be my answer.
May not be able to.
Okay, that's the road we're heading down right now.
And I personally, I'm okay with that. I'm okay.
I just want to agree with Don. This is, if we go down the path of off-site parking, it's an enforcement nightmare for the neighborhood, for the neighbors to be constantly talking about that. And remember that the parkers that we are talking about are people coming from out of town who just want to do what they want to do, and they are going to park in front of where they're renting whenever they can. And I just don't see the practicality of going down a road of, you know, part of the solution here is off-site parking when it just won't work that way.
Looks like
So all of those cars we are talking about, those 3 cars for those 3 bedrooms, are most of the time going to be on the street and in front of that unit.
Yeah.
All right, well, I don't hear any support for off-site parking on the planning board unless there's someone who hasn't spoken up yet. All right. Other issues we need to discuss.
Well, a couple more, if I may, chairs. Yeah, so I think the loophole that Mr. Cow pointed out about owner adjacent rental units, I think you heard from Councillor Macaulay that wasn't intentional. So we could just take the language at the end of limited share rental unit and tack it on to the definition of owner adjacent rental unit. I think we've closed that loophole, as Councillor Macaulay said. that they have to be personally and physically present overnight on the same lot, because it might be multiple units adjacent. Talked about parking. I think Stephanie Nikotich, I had in my notes from a meeting earlier, in the definition, sorry, section 5, subsection 5, ineligible units. She pointed out that we may be changing the definition of an in-law apartment. The trend in Massachusetts is to do accessory apartments.
Yeah.
I think we can write for it, we can legislate for that. You just change it to say no unit for which an in-law apartment special permit has issued, or similar unit under, section Roman numeral 12A or its successor provision. We can get the city solicitor to have us, write the magic words so that if the in-law apartment provision is changed to accessory, we're covered. And then what I was suggesting, if people want to go there, is you could add a little D, letter D, no unit located within the smart growth overlay district shall be used as an STRU. And then we've dealt with that. That's all I had.
Okay. I don't know if we're going to come to any other conclusions on any of the outstanding issues if we continue to discuss this. So I'm wondering if we should identify those pieces that the planning board agrees to have in their recommendation and then vote for a recommendation. But first I see Alden's hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to get a little more information about the restriction in the 4H number 2 with the, is that the one? Let me see. Yeah, the home share. And I just see where it, restricts it to the total number of days where they're rented when they're not physically present shall not exceed 90 days. And I'm assuming the intent of that is just that since they won't be there and more than 90 days would require at least 3 chunks of rental business, at least, that's the concern, that they're concerned about having turnover in rentals when the owner's not there. I just wondered if that was the intent.
It's not the intent of having concern with owners moving on, right? Because many of these folks use a cleaning service or property manager or something like that to be able to, a business agent to be able to do that. I think the feeling is that we're now 90 days is the time frame we think that people 90 days throughout the year, right? They don't have to be consecutive, is enough for the neighborhood to be able to absorb homes not there, people not in their homes renting them up.
All right. Counselor Tantar, I guess I can call on you. Your hand's up.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to note that in the general law ordinance, we have a section on that says that disallows in-law apartments to be used as short-term rentals, and it reads in-law apartments as that term is defined in the Newburyport zoning ordinance or successor or similar uses such as so-called accessory dwelling units or secondary dwelling units. They are not allowed. I was wondering if Councilor Eigenman thought that that was sufficient.
Yeah,
if it also had to be added to the zoning.
Yeah, no, as a matter of fact, that sounds familiar. I think we had this discussion. And I think that's where the language came from. That's exactly what I had in mind. That would do it.
Yep. Thank you. But it doesn't have to be in zoning. It's in the license.
You might, I mean, if you wanted it in both, I mean, it's just a question of how easily you want that repealed, right? Because it,
Yeah, yeah, I get it.
I have had conversations with the members of the Housing Trust, and they would like to keep that in here, just to make it clear that we are doing our best to control those units separate from short-term.
So Chair Sontag, where is here in
In the short term, in the short term, I'd like to repeat basically that definition here as Counselor Eigenman had suggested here in the zoning ordinance for short-term rentals. Yeah.
Thank you.
And that would be in section 5. Is that what we're referring to?
It's section 5C. Yeah.
Yep. Okay.
I'm not going to worry about the some of the wordsmithing, but I do think you have to change some things while we're in section 5. Under A, it should be city and not town. So just kind of look through it and make sure you've got all the right words. All right, on much more significant issues, I'm going to try to list what we would include in our recommendation. I think that's the way to go, and unless someone has a different approach. Okay. I think we agreed that we would like to see in the use table that it's allowed by permit in R1 and allowed in B1, but forbidden in the small growth district. I don't recall if we agreed to permit in the high street residential areas. Does someone on the planning board have a recollection or a proposal? Are we going to permit it, allow it to be permitted there and let licensing and enforcement take care of any concerns about large events happening? Or do we want to leave it not permitted?
Chair?
Oh, I'm sorry, I wasn't watching. I'm so sorry, Rick.
Thank you. I would recommend that we allow it in the high street residential district, particularly because if we don't, we're allowing it on one side of High Street and not on the other side. And there are large structures on both sides and there are small structures on both sides. So there's no substantive difference, I think, between the two. And I think that, we actually have had a bed and breakfast on the north side of High Street, which has had no negative impact on the neighborhood. So I think that should be a no-brainer to allow it in the high street districts. I also think that, and this is beyond what you said, but I think we should allow it in the conservation district. I think that farm vacations can be, very attractive. So, I mean, that's another step, and there's very few properties that would affect, but it's something to consider. But I definitely would recommend High Street as part of this, as well as R1.
Okay, Alden, please.
Yeah, I was just going to support that for the high street. And I would think that licensing would come into play as far as I don't quite see the concern with large events where we're talking about rooms being rented and there's the limited number of rooms. So I think that licensing would take care of that. And I agree on the conservation area as well, especially since there are some housing areas along Water Street that are marked conservation, that are just residential areas.
Thank you for that reminder. Heather.
I also support High Street. I think that if licensure does control things like groups, large groups and weddings, it satisfies the bedroom count in the driveways, and it also gives distance for noise in between the structures. So I think that they should have the opportunity to also participate.
Okay, so I will add High Street Residential A and B. And I haven't heard from everybody, but is it okay to add, is there any objection to adding conservation district to be permitted as well? Okay, so those 4 changes there. On the definition, we agreed that defining a bed and, well, it's the other way around. A short-term rental is not a bed and breakfast or a lodging house. And we were told that the zoning administrator or the building commissioner would make a decision on whether it's a bed and breakfast, lodging house, or a short-term rental. So effectively, our concern goes away. Is that what people understand? And is that definition, Councilor McCauley, is that actually in here, or does that have to be added? That a
Has to be
short-term rental?
Has to be added.
Okay, so add that, and that would be part of our recommendation. Okay. Parking. We don't have an agreement on that. I'm hearing that 1 parking space per guest bedroom cannot be enforced. It is not an enforceable option on and especially if we have in here where it already says off-site, that's not enforceable. So I don't know what we want to do about that. Rick?
Yes, thank you. I agree with Councilor Eigenman that we have to have a parking requirement. I think we brought up the Barnstable case in the past. And if we do have a parking requirement of 1 parking space per bedroom, I think this is going to basically eliminate short-term rentals in the South End. And I do think that the off-site requirement is probably untenable. I think that I think if you're going to require parking, you need to require it on site. So I guess the other thing is, do we be as strict as 1 space per rented guest room? We could be less strict there. We don't have to go to that level of strictness, but I think we have to recognize that if we do, that's probably going to be the single thing that limits short-term rentals in the R2 and R3 districts.
Don?
Yeah, I was going to suggest that I thought we did have agreement on the 1 parking spot per bedroom, and I understand what the effect of that will be, but I also appreciate the uniformity with other requirements we have for hotel rooms, et cetera. So I like it. It's simple, it's clean, and I just think it's the right way to go.
Could I hear from
and Bonnie, to your point, I don't know what you do if there's 5 of us that agree and we all vote on this. There's 3 that dissent. So I don't know how you're going to handle that later administratively.
It's only a recommendation, and
I understand. Yeah.
Unfortunately, leave it to the city council to have to resolve this. I'd like to be able to help them more, but they understand from planning perspective that this is what ties us in knots.
Yeah. So I guess my perception is that the planning board, at least 5 of the planning board members would agree with the 1 parking spot, and well, again, the offsite is that's off the table, as Councilor Eigens told us.
So part of our recommendation would be to remove off-site parking from what is in the proposal right now.
No, I don't think we have to remove it because Councilor Eigenman said it's in there, but it's a moot point. It's irrelevant unless you're in the business, unless you're in the downtown district, he said, unless I misunderstood Councilor Eigenman.
Right, so it does, okay, I see what you mean. So there are limited areas where you can take advantage of it. So let's at least let them do that and leave the offsite in there.
Good point, Bonnie.
Okay. Okay, final possibility for comments from other board members before we make a recommendation.
Two quick comments, Bonnie, just
Yes.
on the parking one more time. You might want to clarify in the language that the offsite parking relates to the business districts specifically, so that there's no misinterpretation of that. The other thing is, Councilman Argument, I think, acknowledged the change in the definition to the owner adjacent unit that requires the owner to be present when it's rented. Just want to make sure that's in the recommendation as well.
So owner adjacent requires on property, I think it was, rather than just on site, in property residence. All right, we don't need to touch the off-site piece of this other definition because it's already in there and it'll take care of itself in the licensing process. Don, your hand's still up. Is it meant to be?
No, I'm gonna lower it. Sorry.
All right. So let me try to read these through without any corrections, and then that'll be the basis for the motion of what we are going to recommend to the city council be approved with these changes. That it be allowed in conservation district R1, B1 with a footnote forbidden in the smart growth district, and allowed in high street residential A and B. We add to the definition that a short-term rental is not a bed and breakfast or lodging house. We add parking, 1 space per guest bedroom. And we add to the definition of owner adjacent that it require on-site within the property residence. Does that capture it all? Any additions, any changes? So I'd like to have a motion to, yes, Bob.
Just, I hate to keep coming back to that, but on-site residence when the unit is being rented.
When the unit is being rented.
Yeah, I have that language.
Yeah.
Good,
Okay.
good.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. I'll take a motion to recommend approval with these additions that have just been identified. Who will make this motion?
I'll make it, Bonnie. Don.
Thank you, Don. And second?
I'll second. Alden, second.
Okay. Take roll call for approval. Alden?
Yes.
Beth has had to leave. Bob?
Yes.
Heather?
Yes.
Rick?
Yes.
MJ?
Yes.
Don?
Yes.
Bonnie? Yes. Excellent work, everybody. Thank you so much. Over to you, Counselor Shand.
All right, thank you. It was much appreciated. It's good work on y'all's end. I would actually recommend for our committee that we keep it in committee until we get the actual verbiage rewritten and then review it amongst ourselves. So I take a motion to do just that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Let's just keep it in committee and do we have anything other business? And then a motion to adjourn.
Well, we do need to close the public hearing.
Oh, I beg your pardon. Well, I would make a motion, I'll do that. A motion to close the public hearing, but keep the matter in our committee.
So I would second.
Okay.
All right. So all those in favor, Counselor Wallace,
Yes.
Counselor Eigenmann,
Yes.
Counselor Shan, yes. Motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
Counselor Wallace.
Yes.
Yes.
All
Counselor
right.
Eigenmann, thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Oh, the Red Sox.
Okay, we are into our agenda on the planning board's meeting tonight. If I can find it, I'm throwing papers around here. Okay, request for waivers. It is at 166, 168 Route 1. I want to emphasize that these are submittal waivers and not permanent ones, meaning that they will be, the issues will be addressed later in the permitting process, but this is just to get the application submitted and the public hearing opened and our consideration of it going as soon as possible. And Andy has agreed to give you a little bit more background on this so that you understand what it is we're asking you to vote on.
Thank you, Chair Sontag. So this time comes up not infrequently. We look at the time of application to see if there's anything that the applicant's looking to waive at the time of submission. But obviously, as the chair mentioned, we're still going to want these details prior to any kind of approval on the project. The reason that the applicant here, and I think that Lou McHucci from Minko is here tonight, in case there's any questions, excuse me, as the chair mentioned, this isn't about the waivers for design in the project or anything like that. This is just to initiate the hearing process. Our plan at this time would be to start the hearing process on the 3rd of November. What they've asked for is a couple of things. The one in particular that I would draw your attention to is stormwater management. We have spoken to the engineer of the project and he's agreed to get that report and information to us by the date of the hearing. So that in essence, Phil Christensen, the board's consulting engineer, and John Ark White, the city engineer, can take a look at that. But recognizing that there is going to be a fair amount of discussion with the planning board, presumably on the first night, relative to the overall site layout, the building design, landscaping, things like that. It didn't seem much of concern to the office anyway, that be held off for a couple of weeks because that's more of a technical issue that is partly driven and dependent on the design of the layout of the project. So we did it. We've had a number of good productive working meetings with Minko to work out some issues, and you might see some further plan revisions from them to address some concerns that have come up in our so-called tech review. But at this time, we recommend, certainly don't have any objection to granting the waiver as noted in the staff report, with the recognition that all these things would be needed prior to approval to ensure the project addresses any concerns that are typical in the 40R district.
Are there any questions for Andy on this? Rick?
Yes, Andy, so these waivers would enable the applicant to submit an application. I assume that although there's stuff on the website, the application actually hasn't been submitted yet, and it will be maybe formally submitted tomorrow or something like that, and that will start the hearing process. Is that what the effect of this waiver would be?
Actually, it's a little bit like that. Just to clarify, the application materials that they've submitted are sufficient with the exception of this waiver. So in essence, they have the submission materials, but what's required here is that the board grant waiver of the submission requirements prior to us deeming that application complete. So with the granting of this waiver, again, only for the start of the hearing, not something that the board would expect during the hearing process. With that, we would be able to advertise based on what they've already submitted.
So I guess just to follow up, so this vote would actually start the clock.
That's correct. That's correct. Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, let me read the motion and we'll ask for someone to make it. Motion to grant the requested waiver of initial submittal requirements for the Smart Growth District Plan Approval Application for 166-168 Route 1. and to schedule the required public hearing for this project for November 3rd, 2021, on the explicit condition that said materials must be provided to the board and city officials for review and further revision if necessary prior to approval of the project. May I have a motion to that effect?
So
I'll
moved.
make that motion, Rick.
Whoops, I heard MJ first, so Rick.
Second.
Yeah, MJ and Rick.
Glad I didn't have to repeat that.
And I didn't have to do it from scratch. Okay, I'll take a roll call on approval. Walden,
Yes.
Bob,
Yes.
Heather,
Yes.
Rick,
Yes.
MJ,
Yes.
Don,
Yes.
Bonnie, yes. So that's good to go, and we'll see them on November 3rd. Next is approval of minutes for September 15th. May I have a motion?
This is Don, so moved.
Second,
I'll second, Alden.
I'll take roll on that one. If you weren't there, please abstain.
And Bonnie, this is including comments that have been made.
Oh, I'm sorry. Were there any comments on it? Yeah, I'm sorry. Ooh,
I
God.
had submitted some comments.
You have. Anything substantive we should know about?
I submitted,
Nope.
Okay.
I submitted a small comment.
Okay.
Which date was this one? Sorry.
This is September 15th.
Okay.
Okay. So check your calendars or your memory or whatever to make sure you can, how you should vote on this. Alden,
Yes,
I'm sorry, as amended, just to be official.
as amended. Yes,
As amended. Alden, yes.
yes,
Bob,
Yes.
Heather,
I abstain. I wasn't a member yet.
Rick,
Yes.
MJ,
Yes.
Don,
Yes.
Bonnie abstain. Okay, October 6th, our last meeting. First, I need a motion to approve the minutes.
I'll make that, Bonnie, Don.
Thank you. Second,
I'll second, Alden. As amended, I sent a small comment.
okay, so both of those are as amended. Anything substantive we should know about in any of the comments that anybody submitted?
I had there was on page 6, there's a motion that I made and I couldn't figure out what it was. There seemed to be some words missing from it. So if somebody else had some revisions to that wording, it'd be helpful. I sent that in with that comment. And the recording is not up, so I couldn't check it.
Yeah, I think Linda can get access to that recording by twisting some arms if it isn't available. So she'll take care of it. Thank you. I can see you're smiling. Good. Okay, so let's move to approve that with a roll call. Alden,
Yes,
Bob,
Yes.
Heather,
Yes.
Rick,
Yes.
MJ.
Yes.
I don't know if you were there last meeting, were you?
Yeah, I thought I was.
Oh, all right.
I just checked, and that was a long one because I actually read through most of it.
Okay. Don,
Yes.
Bonnie, yes. So
Excuse
that's
me, Bonnie,
yes.
who
Yes.
seconded that motion?
Alden.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So that takes care of everything on the agenda. There's only one thing that I wanted us to consider, and I don't know about the rest of you, but I can hardly see straight after all that discussion, even though it's not all that late. But if you want to discuss it, it's fine with me. It's the idea that's come up from several of you to consider reducing the membership from 9 to 7 on the planning board, and then considering whether we would like to have 1 or 2 alternates. And that would be, once we decide we want to do it, that would have to go into an amendment that would be approved by the city council. So my idea is anyway, that we discuss it either tonight or at a subsequent meeting and come to an agreement. And whatever that agreement is, we submit it for council approval in the new year, because it's too late this year to get anything through. So there's no urgency in having a discussion tonight, but if there's some comments people want to make, I'm open to hearing them.
Well, I guess just to have a brief comment, I support the idea of reducing from 9 to 7, and I strongly support going to having 2 alternates, because that, as I say, gives us a farm team of people who start with less responsibility and work up, and also when we do have absences, it gives us a full board.
It does, and I do have a question about that, because I've never really understood how it works. If you're an alternate, do you attend all the meetings in case you're going to be called on for something that's been continued so that you can then participate? Or do you have to listen to previous recordings and get up to speed that way?
Typically, all members would attend.
That was my
So
question.
alternates attend all the time, but they don't say anything unless they are upgraded to replace the member who's absent.
Well, yeah, and if I could comment, I don't think there's any necessarily a reason why they couldn't comment, but they obviously would not be voting. I guess I wouldn't say that you necessarily need to preclude their comments.
Oh, so they're basically a member, other than they can't vote if there is a full contingent of 7 members there.
Agreed.
Oh,
So in
this is,
terms of deliberation or discussion, there's no reason I think why you couldn't take their input, even if they're not voting.
but they don't constitute part of the quorum.
Correct. Yeah.
Well, wait a minute. They would
Unless
if
they're needed.
Yeah.
Unless they're needed.
unless they're needed. So voting if they're needed and quorum if they're needed. And then, of course, they're a full member that night. Wow, that's interesting.
And also it is typically used not just for somebody to fill in for somebody who's missing from that meeting, but if on one application, one of the members has to recuse themselves, then you can appoint the alternate for that particular application.
Right.
Oh, okay. So they would just participate during that discussion and would be able to vote on it, carrying through to the end of the hearings on that application.
Right.
This sounds like a good deal. I don't see any downside to it.
Also, on top of that, I think I mentioned this to you, Bonnie, outside the meeting. If we're considering reducing the membership from 9 to 7, I would also think hard about perhaps reducing the term from 5 to 3 years. It might help attract people who aren't quite sure. And many boards have 3-year terms.
How does that sound to other people who've been more recently appointed to the board than I have? Would that have made a difference? Well, you're all here and you're all committed to whatever period of time you're here. Some of you are shorter than others because you've replaced somebody. And so there's that experience. Heather.
So I like the idea of the 3 years. I didn't know it was 5 years when I initially started the process. And it just felt like a long time, even though I committed to it. My one question is, how long has it been 9 members? Has it always been 9 members, or was it at one time 7 and then you went to 9 and now you're just going back to 7?
I can only
Is it
speak
because you're just having a hard time?
Well, I can speak for 19 years. It's been 9. I don't know how many before that.
Yeah, I think if you go way back, it was less, but it's been quite a while, as the chair said.
Can I ask a general question?
Yeah.
Why? Like, just because you're having a hard time finding people? Is that the main reason?
It's not the first time it's come up, and I've never thought it was an issue. I thought it was great to have 9 people, not understanding how alternates work. And if that had been explained to me ages ago, even when I wasn't a chair, I would have been more in favor of it because it's a lot of people to make sure you have, and you need a larger quorum with 9 and so on. So administratively, it makes it easier. And secondarily, yeah, it's became obvious that we were having a hard time filling. We now have 2 open slots with no active candidates at the moment. That could pass. So I know where you're going with this. I think that we have to make sure that this is the right thing to do no matter what, and not just have it be circumstantial and someone look back a few years from now and say, oh boy, they made this decision only because they couldn't find candidates. That'd be a terrible outcome.
So can I ask one more question? So if you only have 7, I mean, maybe 9 show, but the alternates don't really have to show, I guess. And you only have 7 and 2 people can't come, you call on the alternates to fill those slots, right?
Yeah.
Okay. I was just checking.
Yeah. I mean, the alternates, it sounds like, really are supposed to be there at every meeting in case something comes up.
Right.
So you're still working with 9 people, but you only legally have to have 7, and you only have to have a quorum of 4, right? Have I got the numbers right? Rick, your hand's up.
Yeah, so I did some research on this. First of all, most towns, I think, have 5-member planning boards because they're elected and they all have 3-year terms. So it's not a prevalent thing necessarily to have 9. So Salisbury, for example, has 5 with 1 alternate. Amesbury has 7. And then at the other end of the spectrum, Salem has 9 members with 2 alternates. So they have to find 11 people. So it's, there's no magic number, but I think you just do with, what you can work with. And, another town I work with has 7 members and 4 alternates, and it's a real zoo sometimes.
Yeah.
But, I think that 7 with 1 or 2 alternates would really be maybe the magic number.
I would assume it's based on population. I mean, the other Salisbury and Amesbury are towns. We're a city, but we're such a small city that I imagine it has to do with the numbers. I mean, it's just that.
I worked in the town of Framingham, which at the time was 65,000 people and had 5 members.
That's crazy. That's crazy.
MJ, I don't, you bring up a point. Would you find it interesting if we looked at and you differentiated between town and city governance? Is a great point. And also, quote unquote, benchmarked, looked at some other towns besides the 2 or 3 that Rick looked into. And on the other hand, I also agree, just because, as my mother used to say, everyone else jumps off the Brooklyn Bridge doesn't mean you have to jump off the bridge too. But, there is something to be saying. If everyone else did that in a similar situation, then why are we being different? Is Newburyport that unique? And of course, there's pros and cons to that point. But do you think that would be helpful to even when we eventually brought it up to the city councilors, if we did to get some of those statistics?
Like Rick said, I mean, I think it sounds like it's all over the place. Yeah, I mean, sure, it's helpful. I'm just kind of curious about the whole thing. It's the first I've heard of it, so I'm just getting the facts here, I guess.
Yeah, good. Now, then I'm glad I brought it up because we can look into some more statistics on it and just think through what it would mean. I don't have any problem with taking the term back to 3 years. I always tell people, yeah, the term's 5 years, but we're not going to put your feet in concrete and make you stay if you have to leave.
Well, that was my question when I went in front of the mayor. I was like, what? It's 5 years. What happens if I move? Oh, okay, you can get out of it. Or, what happens if something comes up? And so, yeah.
But it would be cleaner because if we had, well, here's the other side of it. Now, let me forget that comment and go somewhere else. Would we have more turnover if we had more frequent turnover, if we had 3-year terms instead of 5-year terms? What impact would that have on the longevity of the members, and how big a deal is it? and again, that's for most of you who've come much more recently than I have, to know that you're signing up for 5 years if you get a full term. That this isn't for those of you who are filling in somebody else's term. Would make a big difference in your willingness. Heather's already spoken to that, and she was good enough to just carry on anyway. But it might have been easier for her if she'd known it was 3, right?
Correct, yeah.
Yeah, I felt the same. Yeah.
And you might
I
really
agree with that.
say you want to come on, you want a reappointment. Sorry, Bob, I cut you off.
No, I was just saying I agree with the 3 as well. It's a little more appealing than 5.
Well, and also it's appealing because if you say you want to continue, you're hitting a 6-year mark instead of a 10-year mark, which also seems more realistic for a lot of people.
Right. Right.
Oh, very good point. Yeah, I like that. Okay, let's leave it on the table. Think about it. I'll put it on the agenda maybe, sometime later this fall, and we'll come back to it and make a decision so that the staff can put together an amendment and find a sponsor and do something about it in the new year. But we probably have a little bit of time on that as well, because they won't be fully functioning till the end of January, the council. In the meantime, we're still looking for candidates, because even if we bring people through the process, we need 9 in total to fill the alternate slots. But it makes it easier if we don't fill them to go with 7 members. So we'll just hobble along for the time being. And thank you, MJ, again for hanging in here for now anyway. Andy, any other updates?
No, I think at late time, I'll just provide 2 things real quick. One is you may want to just stay tuned, and going forward to next year, there may be some more discussion, or even in the coming months, some more discussion relative to Waterfront West. Some of you who've like Chair Sontag, Rick Tainter, and some others, Dawn, who've been on here for a while, have dealt with Waterfront West before. And just because of prior discussions with New England Development, their recent discussions with Avalon, I presume there'll be some discussion in one way or another, whether it's Waterfront West or 40B or otherwise, relative to both what's appropriate for Waterfront West and any zoning changes that might be appropriate from the city's perspective. So just a heads up that might be something that the board is looking at more in the coming months. The other thing I would note is, I think Rick knows this, we're working with the Resiliency Committee, and I think I know Rick and any other planning board members are interested in weighing in on the site plan standards that we had talked about for the next zoning package, which obviously we wouldn't be bringing at the tail end of this council term, but rather in January or February when they're reconvening as another term again. We want to bring forward another packet. And so any suggestions that you have for changes to the standards that you'd like to see people meet? In essence, one thing I'd like to see, and Rick is part of the group working on this, is to create some standards for resiliency in addition to the typical groupings or chunks of standards that we have in our site plan standards. Putting that in resiliency standards in that section, and also elsewhere in the ordinance as appropriate, standards or criteria by which you'd be reviewing projects. So if it's not a specific standard that applicants would need to meet with a project for resiliency, it would maybe be a criteria that you're reviewing it under, and they'd have to demonstrate how they've responded to that criteria. So just a thought as you're looking at this. I know Rick spends a good amount of time on these things, but for any other members who want to weigh in on standards that are appropriate, changing existing standards, adding standards, or in the case of resiliency, adding resiliency specific standards for consideration of safe projects along the river front, for instance. We'll look forward to your suggestions on that. The idea is to kind of consolidate all together into one amendment or one chunk of amendment that will be going forward to the council next year to deal with other housekeeping things that we've held off on, trying to do things in chunks.
Okay, I have a question about your first comment. I heard in passing having to do with Waterfront West, any zoning changes that might be coming up. How do you envision that happening? Because I have been pushing to revise the overlay district since we denied the first round of the Waterfront West proposal. So Do you see some zoning discussion coming up prior to any application coming forward?
That remains to be seen. The mayor and I will be having a meeting with New England Development shortly. We'll see where they stand in their timeline and what they'd like to put forward. But I think they'd obviously be interested in talking to us in one way or another about their existing district and what could be done with that as compared to parsing off housing as a 40B project or otherwise. So we're sure they're interested in talking about it to some degree, but I imagine that this will be somehow initiated on the council side. What I don't know is whether or not that will be with a formal amendment or what seems more likely to me is some more informal discussion about what is agreed to in terms of policy or scale, size, and massing and so forth, rather than looking at the language and being in the weeds on that initially to agree on policy at the higher level. Obviously, I've suggested over time that I think it's really important, whether or not it's codified or not, that the so-called joint hearings that we had, like we had tonight, I think it's really important that the planning board be integrated with the council during those deliberations about what should be done. That is the reason why under statute, the planning board is an advisory board on zoning changes, thinking long-term about the community for land uses. So I do think it's really important that the planning board consult with and take input from the planning board on the Waterfront West zoning amendment, if there is one, recognizing, of course, that ultimately the decision is left to the council to make.
Well, if there is a working group, informal or otherwise, I would recommend that you ask for 1 or 2 planning board members to participate prior to it being formalized into a proposed amendment.
I will certainly do so. Yeah.
I think if tonight's any example, I don't know if Councilor McCauley found this helpful, or we were just, a pain in the butt they had to deal with, and then he's going to go on and do whatever he wants to do. We'll see. But on the overlay on the Waterfront West area of the city, with zoning being considered, it would be nice if we could be if we could participate sooner rather than later. And it doesn't, I'm not going for an overlay district or anything specific, just whatever is being discussed. I would really appreciate it if planning board members were participating in that informally before anything formal is submitted.
Agreed, or wholeheartedly.
All right, I've said it, you've said it, we'll see what happens. And it's on the recording. Anything else from anyone else? Questions? Anything on your minds?
Just wondering what the status is of the waterfront park. If there's been any more updates recently since the last presentation.
Andy, can you?
Materials, you mean, being submitted?
Yeah, I mean, there was a presentation about what, a month ago, 6 weeks ago, and I know there were a lot of public comments around that. So I was just curious what the current status and timeline is.
Yeah, there isn't anything new at this point, I guess. That's
okay. Thanks.
Okay, I'll take a motion to adjourn.
So moved, Alden.
Second.
MJ, I will.
Thank you. Take roll on that. Alden,
Yes.
Beth, I'm sorry, Bob,
Yes.
Heather,
Yes.
Rick,
Yes.
MJ,
Yes.
Don,
Yes.
Bonnie, yes. Well done, everybody. This was a challenge and we rose to it. So thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I like working with you. You're a great team. All right, good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Night all.
All right. Night.
good night.
Night.